If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to If This Goes On, Don't Panic. Today we have author Cynthia Gomez with us. As of right now, Diane has not been able to make the podcast. Hopefully she will be making it in a little while. So I am going to skip ahead to a few announcements and then we're going to bring our guest on. We are continuing to work on the website. Hopefully by the new year, we'll have a website together for you all, including a new logo. So we're pretty excited about that. And a good place for our transcripts, because right now we're really struggling to get our transcripts in an obvious place on our site. Kind of a long story, but transcriptions are being edited as we speak. So that continues to move forward. And we do have some ideas for some new Patreon stuff. So expect some new Patreon stuff to be going up. I don't want to get too specific about that quite yet. When we start getting some material together, then I'll be a little more specific about that. But I guess that's it for right now. When we come back, we are going to have Cynthia Gomez with us. And we are back. Cynthia Gomez writes horror and other types of speculative fiction, set primarily in Oakland, where she makes her home. She has a particular love for themes of revenge, retribution, and resistance to oppression, and she loves to write dark and frightening things while cuddling with her shadow, aka her adorable little dog. Her work has appeared/will appear in fantasy magazine Strange Horizons, Luna Station Quarterly, Nightmare Magazine, and numerous anthologies. The Nightmare Box and Other Stories, her first collection, was released from Cursed Morsels Press in July 2024. You can find more of her work at cynthiasaysboo.wordpress.com. And we will definitely be talking about Nightmare Box a little bit today. Welcome, Cynthia.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are very excited to have you on. You have written some very interesting things. I can't wait to dive in and talk about all of them. I want to talk about your contribution to Split Scream as well. But before we get to that, I want to hear your origin story. Tell us about how you got into writing, why you're interested in writing, all of that sort of thing.
So I sometimes say that my loves in order, I think, were reading, writing, and history. And, then you add music in there somewhere. And horror, I think, came on right around the time of history or a little later. So by the time I was 10, I knew all the things that I loved. And like a lot of people who appear, not just on your pod, but just the horror podcast guests in general, will say how we'll always talk about the movie that we watched way too young. And in my case, that was The Shining. I love that movie. It's a great movie, but a terrible adaptation is how I would describe it. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about the problems with Stephen King and the problems with Stanley Kubrick, etc. But it was a game changer for me because I discovered that it was really fun to be scared. And so then I kept going. I went into Roald Dahl when I was younger, and Roald Dahl is pretty wild when you start to get into some of his stuff.
Yeah.
And just a lot of imaginative fun. Were you also a Roald Dahl kid?
I read a few of his things when I was a kid, but more recently, I have read some of his work to my children. So I have a little bit of a fresher approach on some of that stuff, Yeah, he really gets pretty wild sometimes. I didn't remember, or maybe I wasn't aware of some of it. Like, what was the one about the three witches or something like that? There's
his book, The Witches, which some problematic anti-Semitic tropes, you might
Yes.
say. And look, there's plenty of stuff there. Roald Dahl is problematic, and I taught his books when I taught fourth grade. I wouldn't do that now. I would find something
Yeah.
else. But welcome to both being a conscious person and also, especially people of color, people of marginalized groups. We have to do this all the time.
Yeah.
We love books, and sometimes they don't love us back. So that was definitely my own origin. But yeah, I've always loved scary and spooky stuff. I watched way too many horror movies when I was, I think, like 10 and 11. I actually made a list a couple years ago of every horror movie I've ever watched, and I stopped counting at 200.
Wow.
So you get the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. The movie that I watched way too early was Poltergeist.
Oh my God.
I know, right?
Well, so I watched, I think all three of them kind of around the same time and they blur into each other. But so I don't know if the first one, the one that you're talking about, is the one where the kid has braces.
I think so. It's the one with the pool. She falls into the pool of skeletons and stuff.
Yeah.
And she goes into TV, I think.
Yeah.
The pool is what scarred into my mind for all of eternity.
It's pretty scarring,
Yeah.
right? That just the idea, and that's the thing is that some of us are going to watch that and very rightly feel very differently about pools. Some of us are going to go, whatever, and we just we can separate it, and some of us can't, and some of us can and don't want to. Although the human brain is fascinating in that way.
Yeah.
And for me, what I remember about Poltergeist, and again, it might have been Poltergeist 2, but there's this one sequence slash scene where the boy has braces and the metal of his braces starts growing and growing out of his mouth and starts, like, I think, looping together and is coming out of the walls. It is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
The idea of, because this is something that's in his body and it's being pulled out of, it's just, yeah, like I get goosebumps even now just thinking about it. And I remember watching it when I had braces. So you can imagine just the visceral terror.
Oh God.
And yet, now it's fun to recall. So there we are with how we discovered we love
Yeah.
horror.
Yeah. That's so funny. I probably watched Poltergeist when I was like 6 or something, like incredibly way too young. I had a question. Are you Generation X by any chance?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm on that Zennial edge right there. And I swear everybody that's Generation X has this exact story with a different movie. It is so funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could walk up to any Zennial and be like, which horror movie did you watch when you were like between the ages of 6 and 10 that you should not have watched?
And they'll all have a different answer. And mine was The Shining. And then
Yep.
I'm sure there's other shit that I watched way too young too. There's another that my sister could tell you all about that's whose name escapes me, but there's this one sequence where it's a family moves into a house with a ghost in it, the ghost of a girl who died there, I think, or who lived there and then died, but either way. And the ghost is, of course, haunting the house. And one time, the kid puts her feet over the edge of the bed, the way you do every morning when you get out of the goddamn bed. And the ghost underneath reaches out and grabs her ankle. I'm not even going to tell you how many years it took before either my sister or I would put our feet on the floor without first leaning over and checking under the bed.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. The problem with me is my imagination is just so overwhelming sometimes that if I watched one scary movie when I was a kid, it would take me months and months to get over it. Like so after like Poltergeist, my parents were like, "Okay, nope, we're done with you and scary movies, never again," because I would wake up screaming for like weeks, and it was bad. Yeah, yeah. I'm curious going to The Shining. Now, I have never read The Shining, believe it or not. It's actually on my TBR, but I have watched the movie and I really enjoyed the movie. What is it about the movie that makes you think it's a bad adaptation? That's the word I'm looking for.
So the book is pretty enjoyable and it is genuinely scary, even for me who had seen the movie. And
Uh-huh.
a lot of the plot is different. But I think the main reasons why it's not a good adaptation and why I really wish somebody would make an adaptation is that uh, the character of Jack Torrance, the main character, is struggling with notions of contemporary post-war American masculinity. And I'm not being pretentious when I say that. Like, that's exactly a sentence that Jack Torrance would say. And he has this idea that he's supposed to be this provider, and he is an alcoholic, and she's struggling in other ways too. And so he can't provide. And when he moves into this hotel, the hotel it seeks out the weaknesses in his own soul and offers him up this devil's bargain. And those themes of toxic masculinity, the way in which Jack both thinks he's rejecting it and then kind of is not at all, the movie barely gets into those.
Yeah.
And also, the book Jack really does see himself as a loving father, and in many ways he is. In other ways, he's still a piece of shit. But he really does come from a wish to love his child. And so the arc is terrifying because he starts out as a guy who's kind of an ass and has some serious problems, but would never hurt his family. And he goes to being this absolutely terrifying force. And again, the movie barely gives you any sense of that arc. He doesn't have much of an arc. He starts out as, creepy Jack Nicholson, and he finishes as creepy Jack Nicholson with an axe. So
yeah,
you lose that. And then the other thing too is that the character of Jack is going through the history of the hotel, and he really talks about the hotel as kind of emblematic of the whole post-World War II American character. And there's all this sense of U.S. imperialism on the rise. The movie does give you these itty bitty little hints, but like a lot of that is lost, and so a lot of the stakes are just lowered. And also, Stanley Kubrick he makes visually beautiful films, but I don't think he actually understands human beings. And it shows in his movies.
Yeah. Your description reminds me a lot of your story, Red Brick. So, for the audience, in this story, we have a guy who's on border patrol, and I don't think you ever actually explicitly say he's on border patrol, but it's pretty clear. And he starts imagining that he sees this Latino guy, like aggressively walking towards his family, and on all these weird situations, and he kind of just like starts losing it, right, and starts seeing this guy around everywhere until he starts freaking out and doing wildly inappropriate things, right? I mean that story really. There's a couple of your stories, including this one, that really hit the target for me. I feel like as a white guy, you're really hitting the target on some toxic masculinity stuff that's going on. Not to mention the whole racism and at the border and all of this added on top of this. What inspired you to write this story, and like where do you think this is all coming from culturally, or is this always been here culturally? I think you partly answered that question to some degree briefly, but let's tie it together.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's, I mean, for those of us who are writers, we know like we're never going to get tired of when someone holds up a mirror to our story, because it's a different mirror. It's not our own. So whatever it's always going to be different. Whatever someone else picks up on and notices, and what meaning someone makes. So I will never ever get tired of hearing someone say, "Well, when I read your story, I thought of this." So thank you.
Yeah.
And to answer some of your questions, and not in a whole lot of order, when I first started writing that story, let's see, was it sometime in 2020, maybe early 2021? And it was when I was starting to get really furious at Trump's rounding up of and separating of families at the border. And I was thinking about Kirsten Nielsen, who was at that time, I think she was director of Homeland Security. And I wanted to imagine that she was going to be haunted wherever she went by the spirits of the children whose lives she'd ruined, through actual ending of their lives, or just the trauma of separating them from their parents. And that quickly got less interesting than a different question, which is not someone like her who's the leader and the public face, but what about just people who are A, more quote unquote ordinary people, and B, who actually think of themselves as good people. That is fascinating to me, is how all the different ways in which people who think of themselves as good people, how they justify doing terrible things. And so that made me want to write inside the head of someone who is just, a cog in the machine. He is an ice agent, as you picked up on. I never explicitly say that, but he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And he thinks of himself as a loving family man, a good provider. He thinks that there is a very natural order and that it's natural that he's going to be on top and his wife is going to be subservient to him. And so he doesn't even notice things like how, oh, she's just doing everything. She tries to do too much. She's trying to take out the trash and call my kid's school and check the weeds in the garden all on the phone at the same time. And it doesn't ever occur to him to think that the reason why she's doing all that is because he's not.
Right.
um, and so it was it was a fun challenge to try to. I described it as kind of like I was reaching around the character as the writer
Mm-hmm.
directly to the reader and having the character think things that we, the reader, are going to make sense of and that our narrator is too clueless to understand.
Yeah.
Like the details about what the wife is doing, and that he never figures out that it's because he's
Yeah.
left all this shit for her to do.
Yeah. I thought that was a very powerful story. I have a friend who went to Border Patrol. I don't talk to him anymore because he went right wing. He didn't used to be.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. He joined Border Patrol and went hard right as soon as he joined. And
I'm sorry.
yeah, it's a really weird thing. Like in a lot of ways, he's one of the people who taught me to be a lefty and to think in radical ways. So it was very strange to see this happen, but it did. Weirdly enough, it did.
And I think when you were talking, what I was thinking of is a thought that I carry around a lot, which is I'm sure you've heard of this notion of playing the race card, right? And
Hmm.
it emerged from the idea that it's people of color who play the race card. But the truth is that white men are given this race card from the time they're born, and they can't lose it. They can lose some of it by virtue of being disabled, or having a different sexuality or a different gender identity or any of those things.
Hmm.
That doesn't cancel out being queer, for example, but
Hmm.
it's a card that any white man knows he can just play whenever he needs to. And the problem is it's a devil's card.
Hmm.
And to play it is to make a bargain with the devil because it's to claim this place in this order that doesn't exist without oppression. And so your friend, and I have family members who are cops. I have a distant cousin who, I guess he's a cousin in my marriage, who's a Trump supporter. And he is a loving family man with 3 children. And, we've spent Christmases together before he went Trump supporter. And
Yeah.
he played that card because Trump waved it in front of him and said, there's an order and there's a place that you get to claim and it has been denied and I'm going to give it back to you, goddammit. And, it resonates with a lot of people. And,
Yeah.
some people we may be able to pull back from that brink, but a lot of them we won't. But the race card is something that white men get to play, and they're playing it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been very this whole last I don't know. Gosh, I guess we have to say almost 10 years. What, 8 years
Mm-hmm.
have been very interesting and enlightening. And there's people who I saw and expected to play the card that did. You know what I mean? And then of course there's the surprising ones who you're like, oh, I really thought that person wasn't like that, and they are. It's kind of it can be very astonishing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I even have some friends have a black friend who went right wing, which was pretty shocking too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
huh. I just feel like, and he's a smart guy. You know what I mean? It's just,
And he played the male
yeah,
card.
yes, yes,
And for people who are in a position of having like one marginalized identity and then a bunch of others that aren't, I find that fascinating because it's a really twisted position to occupy because it requires being completely okay with the fact that there is this hierarchy
Mhm.
as long as you're not in the bottom. Um,
Yeah.
and I wrote a whether we're going to call it a long novella or a short novel is to be determined, because I sold this story and got to announce the deal like a couple weeks ago. But it's set in '68 and it's called Muñeca, and it's about a bunch of things. But among them is it's this family who has their wealth and some of their land descended from Spanish colonial times. They were white Spaniards. They came here, they were given land by the Spanish colonial governor, and they held on to that land until all of a sudden the land changed under their feet, and all of a sudden they were not citizens of Spain anymore, and they were not citizens of New Spain either. All of a sudden they were Californios, they were Mexicans,
Mm-hmm.
and they started to lose that land that they had only been given because they were white, because it was stolen from the Native Americans and put into their domain. And so these, colonial, former colonial, Spanish colonial folks were perfectly okay with the existence of a racial hierarchy as long as they were on top of it, and Native Americans were below them. And then all of a sudden that hierarchy got shuffled and they found themselves a couple rungs down, and the irony seemed to be lost on at least some of them. And so that shit is just fascinating to me.
Yeah. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. This is so funny. I recorded another podcast earlier
Mm-hmm.
today. It was a shorter one, and I was talking to the other person who's African. We were discussing how American privilege works and how
Mm-hmm.
even from his perspective, African American people were more privileged than people from Africa. You know what I mean? And in those different ways, which is a nuance that I'm not used to hearing much, not knowing very many people from Africa. You know what I mean? So it was very interesting, and it's interesting to see all these levels of privilege kind of it's almost like when you look at the side of a hill, and the outside of it's been kind of scraped away for whatever reason, you can just see the different layers of sediment, right?
Mm.
It used to be a lot less obvious, at least to me. But now I feel like it's just so obvious. You can look down the street and I could point at every house on my street and tell you, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This person votes for this person because of this reason. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Just from knowing a little bit about them.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. And that kind of divisions have got to be like really, to say they're cumbersome is probably understating the point, especially when, your kids might play with their kids, etc. But, that's your metaphor of like, I don't know, sort of, if we could pull back a curtain and see the layers of the hill and the stratification, it's a great one. And I think there's a lot to play with there in writing, because, this has always been a white supremacist country.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just becoming a little bit more and a lot more by the day, open and howling and vicious, but it's always been there. And now we're seeing kind of the ugliness of it, and it's a challenge even for horror writers who play with the ugly and the terrible all day long. How do you capture
Yeah.
an ugliness that is this vicious and this
Uh,
hungry,
yeah.
and yet at the same time that wears a normal face? I
Yeah.
feel like I'm talking about the movie They Live, which is a fantastic fucking movie, and I encourage everyone to go watch They Live if you haven't already. Um, and I feel like he tapped into something that clearly it still resonates because people are still watching that movie.
Yeah. Yeah, so that ties perfectly with a question I have for you, and that is why does horror lend itself to discussing societal issues or social justice issues?
So what's funny is you mentioned recording a podcast. I also was a guest on a podcast just this morning too, because I had to rearrange my life. Like I rescheduled this one with you, for example, from whatever day we had it, because my work schedule has changed. And the reason my work schedule has changed is because I work for a labor union and we are on strike. And so my normal job, which involves sitting at a desk doing research, is now working a strike supply headquarters. And so I'm getting up every morning at 4 a.m. to deliver people their coffee and their rain ponchos if it gets rainy, and their bullhorn batteries and all the things that people need to be on a picket line. And so I mentioned that partly just to give you a little window into me, but also talking about politics,
Mhm.
right? That's what we're doing, is we're engaging in politics by withholding our labor, or our members are.
Absolutely.
And so the question that we talked about a little bit this morning in the other podcast interview was exactly this one: why horror and politics? And I think that part of it is that horror is about fear. It's about lots of other things, but it's
Mhm.
about fear. And so the next question that gets posed is, okay, whose fear? And their fear of what? And so those of us who are used to seeing kind of to keep up with your metaphor of the hill, those of us who are used to kind of peeling that layer back on that hill, which would be, that would be a horrific thing if someone could do that, peel back the layer of a hill without disturbing it. But you know, we are used to seeing the things that even the makers of the horror movie don't know are there. So, for example, Poltergeist,
Mhm.
right? Poltergeist is a wonderful example of how there's all this politics in there that I don't even think all the filmmakers knew they were putting in there. So I'll explain. The premise of Poltergeist is, it's this white middle class family, and they're heterosexual family. And again, in '82, that was the only kind of family that ever got depicted anywhere, was a heterosexual family. So they're a white middle class heterosexual family, and they are trying to claim their right as that family and as an American version of that family by moving into the suburbs. And that's their right. And they are innocent. And so this horror film does what a lot of horror films still do, and definitely in the '80s did, which is they can't work without the presumption of white innocence. This family didn't do anything. They don't have any connection to anything. They are not the beneficiaries of any unearned advantages. Oh no. Like, they are just trying to live their lives and raise their children and put braces on their kids' teeth. And so those of us who either are used to analyzing these things, or those of us who are not in the group that I just named, we have to get good at seeing all those hidden presumptions. And so, not only does the movie not work if the Freeling family isn't innocent, but it requires you to not ask questions, such as, where did that land come from? Who was living on it?
Mhm.
And never mind who built the house, and what kind of horrors were endured by the people who built that house, and what kind of horrors were endured by the people who built the cars that took them to the house, and who built the material that went into the roads. So part of the reason why I think horror is so great for politics is because those are all stories, all that I just said, right? What did happen to the people who built the railroads that built California? What did happen to that land? Who was there first? Who was there next? How did they get pushed out, and what kind of horrible violence was enacted? And when you think about it, what kind of horrible violence was enacted to create white suburbia? So we can hear all those stories if we listen for them. And that, I think, is why horror is particularly rich, because it's such a metaphorical genre, and it's a genre that really lends itself
Mhm.
to hearing what these ghosts are trying to say, and to kind of taking the logical conclusion of the logic and teasing out that metaphor. Like, what would happen if we really did hear all those stories of all the people who I just talked about? And if those stories haunted us and wouldn't let us alone, well, that would make a fascinating horror story, for example. And then there you are, and then you're off to the races and you're running. And I find it tremendously fun. And, doesn't always make for an actual fun movie if you're making it, or a fun story. Sometimes it's dark and terrifying, but still, it's fun to be scared.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Dark and terrifying can be fun too, right?
For sure. And I mean, it can be fun. I don't know about you, but I love roller coasters and
Mhm.
amusement parks and haunted houses. And it's because it's the illusion of danger.
Mhm.
And I'm quoting a John Sayles movie called Limbo. What do we get when we get on a roller coaster? We get the illusion of danger. We get taken to the precipice knowing that we're never going to cross it. And so I think it's similar. I think there's a reason why we tell scary stories around the fireplace. All humans do that. All humans, I think, have scary stories. All humans have stories with monsters in them and boogeymen and bad guys. And I can't think of a culture that doesn't have a boogeyman, although I'm happy to be corrected if there are people who actually know what they're talking about. But I've never known, I should say it that way, I have never known of a culture that didn't have boogeyman. And I think that part is universal. It's universally human. I think the part that is fascinating that's not universal, going back to the question of like whose fear and of what, is when you get past the everybody telling their stories and you get into whose stories get given money to get told, especially movie money, which is, movies are a very expensive medium. So, when you have movie money, whose stories get movie money and movie distribution, and who gets the power of having their stories told on the screen, and who gets to see their own very particular, specific situational fears and biases, like a white family's suburban fear of the dark skinned other. Who is it that gets that specific fear? Who gets to get that fear cast into something that's universal? Like, we're actually not all afraid of the same thing. In some ways we are, but we do not all have the white suburban middle class family fear of the dark other. And yet, if you watched a bunch of movies in the 80s, you would think that that was everyone's fear, or at least you would know perfectly well that it wasn't, but you would constantly be having to put that asterisk on there. And where I write and where a lot of people are writing these days, and it's wonderful, we are that asterisk.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. You mentioned boogeymen in every single culture, and it's making me think of your story. And please forgive me if I mispronounce this and correct me.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one about La Llorona. I forgot to write down the title of it.
The story is The Shivering World. And yes, you have La Llorona basically correct.
The Shivering World. Yes. And that's in Split Screen Volume 2, La Llorona. So after reading that, I was flipping around on the TV and I saw an actual movie called La Llorona. I mean, it was okay. It was not mind blowing by any means whatsoever.
Uh-huh.
But I'm really curious about this creature or character. Can you tell me about it? Like, where does it come from, and what is your interest in this creature?
So first, a couple things. First, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about The Shivering World, because it was out
Yeah,
almost 2 years ago now. And so, there's a natural progression to stories, and it's less common to be asked about the older ones. So thank you.
yeah.
And the other is, I'm curious, did you watch the American movie called The Curse of La Llorona, or did you watch the Guatemalan movie called La Llorona?
Hmm. I don't
Was it in
know.
English or in Spanish?
It was mostly in English, but there were parts in Spanish.
Okay, then you watched The Curse of La Llorona, about which I will say no more, except that we did not speak of that movie. Um, and there
Yeah,
is
it was less than great,
yeah,
for sure.
that's that. Yeah, we don't say anything about that. Um, there is a movie from 2019, or it might have been released in the U.S. A year or two off from that, in Spanish. It's set in Guatemala, called simply La Llorona, and it's by Guatemalan filmmaker named Jairo Bustamante. And I cannot say enough wonderful things about that movie. It's about guilt and atrocity, and the
Interesting.
chickens coming home to roost is too flippant a metaphor for what's actually
Mm,
happening, but it really is about the very long, long shadow that someone's misdeeds cast. And I think if you dug, for example, Red Brick, you would very much dig La Llorona. And I will say very little about the plot because it's fun to just kind of go into it open. But it's a brilliant, brilliant movie, and it will hopefully wash out the taste of the other movie out of your brain, so to speak. But in terms of your question about why La Llorona, so I grew up. I'm mixed race, right? My mother's family is white. My father's family, his parents came from Mexico when they were very young, so they're basically Americanized, and then he was, and I am. And so that's a very particular angle on Latina culture and Mexican American culture. And so I, for example, was not.
mhm,
I didn't grow up with my parents telling me stories of don't stray too far or La Llorona is going to come get you, the way other kids did.
mhm.
But I did grow up hearing about it more as like as an interesting anthropological moment, that there was La Llorona. The origin that I heard, which is going to vary, right? But what I heard was that La Llorona came from Spanish colonial times, and that she was either a mixed race woman or an Indian woman, depending on whose version you're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And she fell in love with a lighter skinned man, but she already had two children, and they were dark children because she herself was darker than he was. And she killed her children in order to be with him. And then, of course, he was horrified and would have nothing to do with her. And she was cursed to wander day and night for the rest of her existence, crying out, "Mis hijos, mis hijos." And, she's the boogeyman or woman that appears in lots and lots of different cultures. But what's interesting is how, at least in the version that I just talked about, how racism and colorism and misogyny all kind of are sprinkled through there, right? And
Oh.
there's the idea that it is truly monstrous for a woman to kill her children in a way that doesn't get talked about in the same way if it's a dude killing his children.
Yeah.
Even though I'm pretty sure that family annihilation is way more often practiced by dudes. The abuser who does if I can't have you, no one can. And
Yeah.
part of the reason why I say that is because I could close my eyes and think of at least 5 different examples that I've heard of in the news over the past, few years, right? 2 or 3 years of exactly that pattern of a dude who is an abuser, whose wife is leaving him or his partner is leaving him, and he kills her and the children.
Yeah.
And I cannot think of any where the perpetrator is a woman.
You remember the spear gun guy?
No. Who's the spear gun guy?
Oh man, I'm pretty sure this happened out in California, and I'm pretty sure it was out west. I don't know. There was this guy. He was like a surfing teacher, and he got into some kind of cult or something, and he thought his kids and his wife were like possessed. So he had a spear gun,
Mm,
and he shot them all with a spear gun. Like this is real life. This is not like a horror story.
yeah.
But yeah, exactly. Jesus Christ. Anyway, I mean, that's the one that just popped right into my mind when you were talking about it. I didn't mean to derail you. Go ahead.
The spear gun guy. Well, no, no. Well, I mean, I'll look him up later, but exactly. Like we don't have, and yet we have in our culture the concept of the monstrous feminine. We have Medea, we have La Llorona, we have other versions of it. And so that was why I thought it was interesting. But really, even before I decided that La Llorona was going to figure into the story, what I wanted was a story of a person who doesn't have a lot of power getting an opportunity, kind of a Faustian opportunity to get access to that power,
Mm-hmm.
and then having to make all kinds of, to say ethical compromises would be underplaying it a little bit,
Yeah.
but definitely has some major crossroads to navigate in terms of what to do with that power and who to use it against or not. And also, what does it do to us if we ordinary people all of a sudden get access to extraordinary power?
Yeah.
And so I knew that I wanted that as a premise. And so then the first question became, all right, well, who gets access to this power? And I decided it was going to be someone who was young because they still have a lot of plasticity of character, someone who was brown skinned, someone who was poor, someone who didn't come from a lot of education. And then I had to decide, what does she want? Well, she doesn't just want to not be poor, but she also wants to be an intellectual
Mm-hmm.
and to be taken seriously as an intellectual because she's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And she wants to occupy that role, which many people who are more powerful than she doesn't see when they see her. They see young brown skinned woman and that's it. And they don't see
Yeah.
an intellectual. And so she wants those things. And she encounters La Llorona and she's kind of dangled an opportunity to get those things, but then at what cost?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very fun and satisfying to write. It was also, I'm learning a little bit every year as I write, but I'm not even going to tell you how many revisions that story went through before it finally saw the light of day.
Oh.
I stopped counting at like 15.
Oh wow. Oh wow. I love that story. It's one of my favorite things that you've written that I've
Thank
read.
you.
And
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. I gotta say, I came away from that story being like, I don't blame her for killing any of those people. You know what I mean? Like,
and there's definitely a thread of that,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I still felt like she was the hero by the end. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that says something about me, but I was like, yeah,
I mean, it's art, right? It's not the same thing as if you had, say, an actual neighbor on your street for real who really did some of what Nayeli, the main character, did in the book, right?
hmm
I'm going to assume that your reaction may be different if it were real, but it's a
yeah,
story, it's a metaphor, right? And so I'm going to say as little as I can about the, what Nayeli does with her power, but I'm kind of glad that the way it was set up, that there's definitely room for the interpretation of good for her,
right.
right? And I myself actually go back and forth on, like it means different things to me at different times, frankly.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say to our audience too, definitely check out the Split Screen series. They're awesome,
Yes,
super awesome. It's funny.
they're wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, they're so good. They're so good. You mentioned you mentioned StokerCon. Was that before we were recording? It might have been. We were chatting about StokerCon in Pittsburgh before we started recording, and that's where I picked up my first split screen. And I think I bought the one that you were in, Volume 2 and Volume 3, and then I went and read them, and I was just like, oh my gosh, these are so awesome.
Mhm.
So then I went and back, and I've bought all of them now at this point, Just so good. In horror, do you feel like there's a lot of innovation going on right now? I mean, aside from diversity, because there's definitely a lot of diversity in horror.
Mhm.
I mean, arguably more than science fiction or fantasy. But do you feel like there's other innovations happening in horror right now?
So I was thinking about innovation in terms of stylistic innovation, for example. So there's this book that I have not read yet that is having a wonderful time. It's called Coup de Grace. You're probably supposed to pronounce it Coup de Grace,
hmm
but I don't have enough for or coup. Yeah, I'm not even going to try the French. But by the writer Sophia Ajram, that from what I have read and heard, and I listened to Sophia on a podcast, is just stylistically and structurally very unusual. It's a guy who is going to commit suicide. He's going to take the train to this place where he's going to commit suicide. And then he finds himself stuck in a station and he can't get out. And from what I have understood about it, it's a very different stylistic and structural form than a lot of horror and speculative fiction that I've read anyway has taken. And so
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's getting all kinds of attention. It's already its third printing and it's barely out,
Wow.
which is just awesome. So clearly, there's a lot of hunger for stylistic innovation and unusualness, which is a word I just invented. But in terms of your question about innovation generally, I mean, I feel like there's the stuff that I tend to write and tend to read is a little bit more structurally, I guess, traditional, to use a loaded word. And part of that for me is, in terms of the stuff that I write,
hmm
is purely because I feel like it takes a lot more chops, at least for me anyway, and a lot more skill to play around with structure and to play around with different forms. Like, I think it takes a lot more chops to write an epistolary novel than a more traditionally structured one. And I think it takes more chops
hmm
to play around with timing, for example, and unusual structures like lists. I think other writers will go, what are you talking about? That's easy for me, right? So all this to say, the stuff that's really innovative, I haven't read so much of. But in terms of the diversity point, I read more horror than I do science fiction and fantasy. But I feel like all of those fields are actually seeing all kinds of writers take up way more space
Yeah.
than they ever used to. And I got to do the HWA Horror Writers Association Hispanic Heritage, Latina Heritage. I'm sure it used to be called Hispanic Heritage, which is another loaded ball of wax there. But I got to do their interview, and one of the things that I said there was, now you could spend your entire reading life never again reading a story written by a cis straight white dude, and you would never run out of
Yeah.
beautifully written, fierce, fearless, amazing shit to read.
Yeah.
You would never run out. You would still have books that would sit on your TBR pile for years, like begging you to read them, and that would never get read because more stuff would keep getting added. And, the talent was always there. It just wasn't getting paid any attention to and given any money. So it was harder for it to be seen by enough people. And so that's a little bit changing.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a reaction to that, right? Because, reactionary politics is a thing. But we don't seem to be in that phase. We seem to be in the flowering phase, which I love and I'm having so much fun with, and which is responsible for the fact that I write at all. So there are two books that are the reason why I write speculative fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And in turn, I wouldn't be writing if I weren't writing speculative fiction because I tried literary fiction and I wasn't good at it.
Yeah, right.
And so I read Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, which was, I think, foundational for a lot of people. And then I read The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. And it's not just that those are awesome books, which they are, but it's also that I really needed to see multiple bits of evidence that it wasn't just straight white dudes writing horror.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought because that's what I had always been exposed to when I was a kid. And I needed to see that there were other examples. And so those two books, there are lots of other people will find the other books were their door. Those were my doors and I got to open them and they were fucking wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, you said so much there and I'm over here thinking about how I want to take this. Yeah, there are so many good writers now. You're right. I mean, any of those genres you could easily read for the rest of your life, non-cis white stories. And I do feel like there is innovation going on, especially in science fiction and horror. I feel like it's less in fantasy because fantasy is like of the three, it's kind of like top dog right now with the romantasy and all that going on, right? But maybe I'm wrong. I'd be honest, of the three, horror is the one I read the least.
Okay.
It tends to be in the fall part of the year, I mean, I read a little bit scattered throughout, of course, but I generally do read science fiction and fantasy. And maybe it's just the authors I've been reading, but I do feel like the majority of the innovation has been in science fiction and horror, particularly.
When you say innovation, do you mean like stylistic innovation or what topics or themes get explored? What do you mean when you say that?
I think everything. Definitely stylistically. Like, so things that pop into mind, like anything Todd A. Thompson does. And he does a lot of horror, science fiction crossover kind of stuff. What was the name of his Generation Ship story?
Now I'm going to look that up.
I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but he described it as he described the pacing as throwing a stone into the air, right? Slow, it starts out really slow and then gets to the halfway point and then it speeds up and just gets quicker and quicker.
Ooh, that is a very good description. I like that.
Yeah. Or if you've read Jackdaw.
I haven't.
You should read Jackdaw.
Okay, I'm looking up Jackdaw.
It's meta horror, I guess, and he is literally Todd A. Thompson is the main character. And so I forget what they call that, autofiction or something like that, right?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and it's about how he's like slowly goes insane. And like a lot of the characters in the book are people he actually knows, and like,
oh my God.
It's crazy. It's very short. It's like 120 pages or something.
Yeah, it looks like it's a novella. And I was looking at the description, he's hired to write a short piece on Francis Bacon, which is already fascinating, right? And I was thinking about this short story, I think it's called The House Sitter or just House Sitter by Bennett Sims. And I know about that because Carmen Maria Machado mentioned it. And so, that's part of what's fun about reading and writing is we get all these little breadcrumb trails to follow, and all of our different authors that we love reading, they leave their own little breadcrumb trails, and then we get to follow them and get lost. And sometimes we find our way back to the same trail and find out that someone else also loved that piece. But apparently it's called house sitting, not house sitter, but whatever. And it is this incredibly claustrophobic story of an unnamed narrator. It's all told in second person. And so we don't know very much at all about the narrator, but the narrator has answered an ad for a position house sitting in the middle of nowhere. and they arrive and things are already weird, and then they just get weirder, and we, the reader, are watching the house sitter slowly lose their grip on reality,
Uh-huh.
and we can totally understand why they are, because they are indeed isolated and stuck. And I'm not giving it anywhere near the due that it deserves, but
Yeah.
like I love a story where we can watch someone's mental state deteriorate slowly and in pieces,
Yeah.
and especially when there's other stuff. But like that stuff's always catnip.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And there are so many examples, none of which I'm prepared to share at the moment because I can't think of them.
Right, because instantly the second you're trying to think of an example, they all go and square you in the corner, and
Yes.
some of them are even mocking you right now. They're
Yes.
like, hey, hey, you don't remember me.
Yes. 100%. Oh, okay, I'll just go from guests that I've had to Nana Reeve Dew. And, I'd put her in the same category as Jordan Peele and talking about race and stuff through horror, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who do we just have? Alex Jennings. Okay, now he's a fantasy guy, so I'm kind of shooting myself here by bringing him up. But oh my God, his book is like almost nothing I've ever read. It's just all over the place, and it's like magical realism with a little bit of science fiction and a little bit of horror thrown in, sort of. But and super definitely and lots
Okay,
of superhero. It's in alternate history, sort of. I can't even. It's just
okay.
it's wild. It's wild.
Which book? This the you're playing all of my songs.
It's crazy. It reminds me a lot of Zigzag Claiborne. Have you ever read any of Zigzag's books?
I know, but here's another that is on that list that is always kind of at the periphery.
Yeah. Okay. So it is called The Ballad of Perilous Graves.
Perilous Graves.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I remember hearing about it when it came out, and just the title alone, it's so cool. And I'm very glad that it's
Oh yeah.
out and that you got a chance to talk to him about it. And I am going to put it on my TBR list just from all the things you just said. And that's one of the other cool things about having not just. I imagine it must be like a constant challenge for you is all the wonderful books that you hear about from hosting a podcast,
Yeah.
and your TBR pile just grows and grows and grows and grows, which is not a bad problem to have, but it is a problem because there's only one of us.
Oh, it is. It is. I do reviews too, so people send me stuff, and it's it's a little ridiculous sometimes. I get oh, just earlier this week I went to visit Paul Jessup, fellow horror writer,
Mhm.
and he was doing
He has
his
a
book
book out too.
release. And what's that?
Oh, I was just saying he has a book out too, but yes, you were about to talk about
Yes. Yes, he does. He does. I went up to visit him because we're pals. So I go up there. I go up there to visit him. You know what I mean? Of course, I get his new book, but he has it in a bookstore, and I'm like, oh, look at this. You know what I mean? They have this whole series here. I'm like, oh wow, I love this author. I'm just gonna pick them up because they're like $2 a piece. You know what I
it.
mean? And then
Mm-hmm.
like, I bring those
Mm-hmm.
home, and I come home, and I have got like 2 packages sitting at the door, and there's books in there, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
god. But so it
Yes, we
gets
are all drowning in them.
yes, yes, yes. Fortunately, my wife is tolerant and okay with that stuff. So
It's a really good ocean to be drowning in.
it
Is
is,
the ocean of books.
it is, it is. I just have to keep it slightly under control, and by that I just mean in my office. It's allowed to trickle out to my bedroom nightstand, but beyond that, I have to keep it in my office. Otherwise, it's fine.
As long as they don't rearrange themselves overnight and reshuffle themselves so that someone else is now on top, then you're
Mm,
good.
that does happen. Probably my kids.
Your kids messing with you.
Yeah, probably. Really, really. Oh, my oldest is a big reader too, so he'll be like, "What's this one about? What's this one about?" And I go through them all. Not quite old enough to read most of them yet, but he's getting there.
Okay, give it a little while.
Anyway, we're a little bit off track. I want to go back to your collection, and we're starting to run out of time too. One story I really wanted to hit on really really badly because I
Hmm.
also was a former teacher, and
Ah,
yeah, your one story took place in a school, right? I related so much to it.
The teacher association.
I related so much. Yeah, the teacher association. So, what's your, where did this story come from? I have to ask. I know that you were a teacher, but tell me how your teaching experience led to this story, and also I'm interested to hear your views around education. Quickly, I will give a summary to the audience. In this story, the main character is a teacher. They go to this new school to teach, but there's like something a little bit off with the other teachers. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, they suspect that there's something very, very wrong. And it is not a spoiler to say that two of my biggest influences, like I was explicit with myself and with the editor, Eric Ragland, who's fantastic and is the editor of the owner and editor in chief of Cursed Morsels. He's got lots of books too, including a collection called Lonesome Pyres that I highly encourage people to check out. But back on the story itself. So he put out this call for the anthology and invited me to contribute to it. And I was explicit with him. I said, I would like to do an homage to Ira Levin, and in particular to Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby. And it was like, great, let me know if you want me to read a draft. And so because I knew I wanted that kind of slow building of, I knew that the part that I really loved about Rosemary's Baby, there's so much to love about that story, but the part that I love the most is that every step there could be another explanation for what's going on. And so it's natural for Rosemary to doubt.
Yeah.
At one point she says, but there are no witches, not really. Right. And so, my response to that is, except when there are. And so I kind of had that as my hook. And so I knew that I wanted to have a charter school where the teacher suspects that something is very wrong. In terms of where it came from, so I did, as I was a teacher for a time. We both were. I taught third grade, fourth grade, and kindergarten, and I also spent a year as a substitute teacher. And
yeah.
So I like substitute teaching. I would still be doing it if it came with affordable a living wage and pension and benefits.
Yeah.
But so I knew that I wanted to talk about my experience in this. It wasn't a charter school, but it was a no excuses, bootstraps style of education that I taught at for 1 year. And it was just such a mismatch for the kind of teaching that I wanted to do. Like I wanted everyone to do sustained silent reading because I had been doing the research, because I was working towards a master's as a reading specialist at the time. And so I would be going to my classes at night, reading all the volumes of research that said how important it is for kids to just get a chance to read every single day, not for school, for pleasure. And then I would do that. And then the principal would walk in and say, why are you students just sitting there reading? And but that wasn't the only problem. The other problem, which is not present in the story, is that I also just wasn't cut out for teaching.
Yeah.
So the other problem was my students would be, throwing spitballs at the ceiling when they're supposed to be reading. So that's not in the story. But what is that mismatch, right? The sense that everything has to be test prep and everything has to be in this very strange version of equity, where on the one hand, these are Black and brown children, and equity demands that they do well on test scores. But on the other hand, no white middle class parent would ever subject their children to uniforms and drill and kill and test prep in the way that these children were subjected. So all the joy was gone. So I really wanted a chance to kind of exercise that in a certain way. And it was quite satisfying, actually, to turn that experience into a story. And I at one point remember feeling really guilty because I created this character, Esther Diaz, and I remember thinking, wow, she's really cool.
Yeah.
Right? Like she has a regular collection of like rock T-shirts, and that's how she gets the kids to talk to her and relate to them. Is like they're always asking her about her T-shirts because she's got hundreds of them, and she just like it's a conversation piece every day. And she's young and she's energetic, and her parents are political, and she brings that into the classroom, and she plays MF Doom, which I did in my classroom. It was one of my warm-up music, Lemongrass. And so I created this character, and she's really cool, and she's way cooler than I ever was. And then I'm not going to tell you what does happen, but there's this cloud hanging over her the entire time. And I felt kind of guilty for being so mean to this character. And she does go through it in the story. Some of it is backstory. But yeah, so that was kind of the premise. But you asked for larger thoughts more generally, larger thoughts, is that I feel like what we are seeing is on a scale writ large is a project that's been decades in the making, the wholesale complete destruction of public education. And we see it in all kinds of different ways. We see it attacking the teaching profession. We see it starving education of any kind of resources. We see it in the regulation of teachers that happens, all kinds of laws saying that teachers have to post their fucking lesson plans on a publicly available document for any parent to read and complain about. Like we could all talk about it, about all the different ways that it's being attacked in a metaphorical sense, being literally attacked, being attacked financially, being undermined, being policed, being starved, and everything from teaching to libraries. And it's not an accident. And it's not just because some people are scared of their own shadow or they are, right? But it's because reactionary politics is extraordinarily ugly. And you can't run a reactionary political program unless you have constant instability and fear. And so you have to systematically chop away at all of the pillars of civil society that people can rely on. And education is obviously one of them. It's not just that. There's also the program of who gets taught what and who doesn't get taught what and who gets to learn and who doesn't, and how to make sure that children never even get a tiny hint of something that would allow them to not hate themselves. So there's all those pieces together. And so, this story was not really explicitly about that. It was, it hinted at it, but it was also a way for me to kind of take a really particular example, which is this charter school. And in my mind, charter schools are about destroying public education.
Unfortunately.
To take this charter school and really hold it up and kind of, it's why horror is so much fun in my mind, is that we can kind of take, again, the logical conclusion of the logic. We can take the metaphor and then just stretch it and reveal itself, make it reveal itself. And then hopefully someone read it will go, oh, I never thought about it that way. That is monstrous.
No, I love that.
And all we did was call up the monsters that were already there.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I do want to go back to Esther for one moment, though, because she had a Bikini Kill t-shirt and a Tiger Army t-shirt, which was awesome. I love both of those bands. Kudos to you.
To be fair, I had never heard of Tiger Army before. This was when Wednesday Addams was real popular on Netflix. And so I did kind of physically picture her as a little bit looking like Jenna Ortega and a little bit like the lead singer of the Marias, whose name I don't know. But when I started looking up, okay, well, Google Muck is a song that I listened to over and over again while I was writing, because I heard about it through the Netflix show Wednesday. And so then I looked up, who else was Google Muck being compared to? And then who else was Bikini Kill being compared to? And all these other bands. And so that's how I heard about Tiger Army. But I don't want to pretend to be I don't want to be a poser. I was not a Tiger Army fan, but she is. So there you go. I can create characters who are cooler than I am.
Well, I gotta say, I being a, I don't want to say former punk, an evolved punk, I Bikini Kill, huge Riot Girl. I mean, like the Riot Girl band, right? Or at least top three for sure. And Tiger Army is kind of like for people who don't know, which is probably almost everybody, they're kind of like this rockabilly punk band from mostly the late 90s, I would say.
Okay.
I think I'm getting my dates right. Late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know if they're still together or not. I think they are. I think they just put out a new record, but I could be wrong about that. But they're just a super fun band. They were on a record label, Hellcat Records, that I really liked. So
I love that name.
Yeah.
I love that name.
It's all punk. I shouldn't say all punk. Punk in related genres like ska, reggae, rockabilly, all that kind of stuff. Awesome stuff. So, okay, I've got one more topic for you, and then we got to wrap up.
Okay.
You and I originally bonded back in the day over COVID stuff, right?
Okay. Oh, that's right. That's right. Because we're the ones who are constantly complaining about the lack of COVID protections.
Yes. I mean, I think it was right before StokerCon and we were complaining about the situation and generally about conferences and people not wearing masking and all that kind of stuff. And even more recently, we were talking about the Seattle Worldcon situation and their guidelines or
Mhm.
lack thereof. I mean, I'm an at-risk person for multiple health reasons.
Mhm.
So this topic's like really important to me. I'm wondering why this topic is important to you specifically, and how do you think conferences should improve in regards to COVID?
Um, so why me specifically? I don't have any particular individual angle. I mean, I know people who are vulnerable, but a lot of us do, right?
Yeah.
I think it's partly because I I've always put a lot of mental energy into like the concept of what we as individuals owe to our fellow humans, which sounds strange to say because that implies that there are some people who don't, right? That's not what
Hmm.
I'm trying to go for here. But a lot of us have different things that kind of pull at us and tug at us, and that's one of the things that tugs at me. So it's always just been so infuriating to watch this abdication of that responsibility to each other. And I also, I live alone. I have a dog, right? And so
Hmm.
there's nobody to take care of me when I get sick. There's no cushion for me. If I lose my job, I don't have a cushion. And so I am terrified of what were to happen if I were to get COVID and become disabled.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of my own personal angle. But again, that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I can't totally answer like why of all the, there are lots of things that bother me, like why this?
Yeah.
But in terms of the other part of your question, what do we owe each other and what about cons? I think that, it's really sad, but there's just been this abject failure of leadership.
Hmm.
It's not hard to lead as a con runner and say, this is our policy. Mask or go virtual, right? It's not difficult to say cons do it. I see pictures of cons, and I think it's just kind of leading to the overall. So something that became clearer and clearer when all of us lived through COVID is that it's not useful to talk about things so much in terms of what individuals should be doing, right? Like, individuals only have so much power acting as individuals, and I think
Hmm.
people who study public health will tell you, yeah, if you want if you want things to happen at scale, you have to actually make structural changes. And so I think it's just brought home how much of the late stage capitalism we're living in is basically just let's pile more fear and terror onto each individual person. Because in addition to all the other things that we already had to worry about, now we also get to worry about whether something as simple as going to a party is going to lead to us getting brain fog and losing a tremendous amount of our cognitive function when we're older.
Yeah.
And this already is a society that is hostile, to say the very least, to people who have any kind of disability.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that just ramp up and ramp up. And I think it's kind of telling that a lot of us haven't really talked about COVID there's not a lot of stories set during COVID. And yes, it's not that, it's still relatively recent. But I also think that it's a horror that's actually too big for a lot of us to talk about.
Hmm.
And it is actually horrifying. The very thing that makes life worth living, which is breathing in close proximity to other humans, like for almost all of us, that's essential. We want to be with our fellow humans. We want to dance. We want to party. That very thing could be an act that will kill us.
Yeah.
That is monstrous. And the COVID itself, what it does to the body, the fact that it can just sit there insidiously creeping its way in and then cause and wreak destruction that we can't see and don't know about until we go to use something that we didn't even realize was gone until we tried to use it. Like, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And yet we're not really dealing with it very much in our fiction. Me neither, right? I haven't tackled it. I tackled it obliquely in a story called Thread Count, where I imagined what would happen if some, like, I don't want to give away Thread Count because it's pretty short and it's a little flash story, but it's basically, what if the pattern that we always see, or natural disasters and pandemics and illnesses always fall first, I'm the most vulnerable. What if it didn't happen that way? What would that look like? And then I won't say anything more about it.
Interesting. Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate that. And
It was quite long. I'm sorry.
no worries. I'm with you. I'm going to keep fighting the good fight and keep trying to push for better COVID guidelines. I know I just joined the board of a local organization that puts on conferences for this exact reason.
Nice.
So
Good for you.
fingers crossed. We'll see.
Okay. Right. Like maybe people really just needed one person to stand up and say it, like you. And then that's more, maybe that's just what's the, who knows?
Hopefully, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know. I'm getting ready. I'm psyching myself up for it, but we'll see what happens. Well, we should start wrapping it up. I always end with 3 questions.
Okay.
What is bringing you hope right now?
I don't have an answer. So in terms of hope for the planet, I don't have any. In terms of hope for society, I don't have any. I have wishes. I have a wish that the anger and the fury and the frustration that we feel can get channeled into, an entirely different political order. But I don't have it's not a realistic hope. It's just a wish. And it's not the same thing. Individually, people who I know and love have good things happen to them, right? And that gives me hope for them particularly. But the only way I can have hope is by just kind of radically shrinking my view to things that allow for that. And I know that that's terribly depressing, but it is also true.
Well, I'll say one thing that you're involved in besides the writing that gives me hope is the union, and seeing all the union action out there has been really amazing in my opinion and inspiring, and I hope that keeps moving forward.
That is true. And it is also true that to go out to the picket lines, for example, it is what happens when people stand up and fight back, right? And that's even one of our chants, right? When we're under attack, we stand up, fight back. And when we fight, we win. And I was part of supporting our members on strike. I worked for the Hotel Workers Union, in case anyone was curious. And so I was part of supporting our members on strike 6 years ago. And it was very, very difficult. And yet we won. And I have no doubt that those members are going to get what they need. And I am very hopeful about that. Again, so we can, if we pick a particular story, there's a lot of good that we can start to see, but we just have to pick a particular story.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have some of the same anxieties you do. Are there any upcoming things that you would like to tell our audience about?
Let's see. I am editing, or will be editing over the couple months, my novella short novel called Muñeca. So it's going to take a while. Keep your ears peeled, but it won't come out until 2026 at the earliest, and it doesn't actually have a release date. It's just, I know how publishing goes. I have a story coming out sometime in the spring called A Girl Goes on a Date Alone at Night. That's going to be in Nightmare Magazine, and that should be really fun. And one of the stories from the Nightmare box, the darkest thing I've ever written by far, called Will They Disappear? That is being collected in Pseudopod's end of the year best of, which I was so excited about. I squealed when I heard. So yeah, and it's the first time that I will have got to hear an audio production on a podcast of one of my stories. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you like audio / podcast versions, you should your ears peeled, for that one.
Awesome. I love it. And where can everyone find you online?
So I have a website, cynthiasaysboo.wordpress.com. I don't update it that often, but I do. And one of the things I'm going to have to get around to doing pretty quickly is doing things like putting podcast appearances on there, because I have got really fortunate now. And now I've had more than one podcast appearance, which is fantastic. But it means it's really good to collect them. So I'll put a link to this on there, as well as some of the others and the stories and other things. So yeah, cynthiasaysboo.wordpress.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this space again, authors really love these opportunities and we cherish them. And so I thank you on everyone's behalf for giving us the space to do it because it's wonderful.
And that was our conversation with Cynthia Gomez. Before we finish up, if you like what we're doing, please share us with your friends on whatever social media that you use these days. Don't forget to rate or review us anywhere that you can get podcasts. We greatly appreciate that. That helps us be seen. And if you really like what we're doing, check us out on patreon.com/ifthisgoeson. You can sign up there to give us a little bit of money every month. I think the smallest amount is $1. So go out there. Please help us. We could use it right now. $1 or $2 a month is almost nothing these days. So if you can afford a couple bucks a month, we would really appreciate it. We do have some new plans for Patreon. We are trying to get that together now, but hopefully we will have that together very soon. And so since Diane was not able to make it today, I'm not going to talk much about books. I'm just going to end this real quick, and let you all move on with your days. So, thanks to everybody for listening. We greatly appreciate it. We are keeping hope alive one episode at a time. If This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited and produced by Alan Bailey. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrowski, and outro music by Sable Aradia. Intro by Dave Robison. A special thanks to our guest, Cynthia Gomez. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.